Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today we have a very exciting roundtable podcast, bringing back the roundtables. Today we have Zach, Josh, and Jake from Data Driven Strength, Mike Zordos's lab, because they all did fantastic work over the past months and years with their meta-analyses, meta-regressions, looking at per session volume to maximize hypertrophy and strength, weekly volumes to maximize hypertrophy and strength, frequencies, and then also relative intensities, proximity to failure, and how that interacts with hypertrophy and strength. And Jake, to give credit to Jake Remmert, he just discussed bringing on all of them to kind of bring together what they think are the great practical take-homes we as hard-going trainees, competitors, coaches, can take away from these studies and practically apply to our own philosophies and our own training. And there's so much great discussion to be found within this, everything from what a meta-analysis is, what you can actually look to take away from meta-analyses, what specifically you can take away from the studies that were done, what limitations there were, and then the practical take-homes for you to carry on with your own training. So much good stuff to be found in here. It was honestly a gold mine. It was fantastic to be able to have these guys on for a roundtable. If you guys love the roundtable, do let me know. If you'd like to see more like this, do let me know. The guys, I'm sure, would oblige to come on for future episodes if there's any specific topics you'd like covered. Again, let me know in the comments. Go and let me know over on Instagram. And of course, if you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel. Make sure to share it, tag myself, tag the guys over on your Instagram stories or over on social media. Share it with anyone you think might find it valuable, because I think there's a heap of gold to be found. Otherwise, let's get into the chat. Guys, I'm very excited for today's podcast. I've got three very intelligent individuals on the show. From Data Driven Strength, we've got Jake, we have Josh, and we have Zach. And Jake actually put it to me to kind of get a podcast for you guys together, because you all just relatively recently released your meta-analyses regarding kind of relative intensity, volume, in-session volume, weekly volume, frequency. And so, Jake, rightly so, put it to me that it would be a great idea to get you all on to discuss kind of the intricacies of these, how they interact, and hopefully give the listeners some really good take-homes, because they probably, if they're listening to this, have digested maybe podcasts with, I know Zach and Josh have done a variety of podcasts together. I've obviously had Zach on, and Josh has been on the podcast talking about bits and pieces from this. And obviously recently Jake was on the show too. So me fumbling our way into starting this podcast, which I think could go in so many directions, which I'm excited for. But I thought maybe a great place to start would be surrounding kind of the methods of your meta-analyses, because I think that probably somewhat sets the foundation and gives people a bit of an understanding. And obviously, like I said, we've done podcasts individually on each of these to like in depth, so we can touch on some summary points and then get into some real juicy topics down the line. But Zach, I know you have had slightly different methods to the other guys, but worth kind of summarizing those so the listeners are aware.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can kind of take this from first and foremost, Steve, thanks for having us all on. I think we're all really, really excited to discuss these things. I think it's a unique opportunity to just discuss them collectively. And I think there's some really, really important and interesting things we can talk about on how they can actually be applied when you are thinking about them collectively, because that's how the average lifter is going to actually digest the information. And I think that's really important to think about when we're actually communicating this stuff. So I think that's a really, really cool idea. Obviously, shout out to Jake with the idea. It's really cool. I also want to personally say I've listened to some of the older roundtables more times than I would like to personally admit to really digest that information. So it feels really, really cool to kind of be on the other side of things here. So that's another hat tip to you, Steve, for just doing such a great job on this kind of stuff for such a long time, and being able to kind of revisit some of those older topics and older roundtables with a little bit of a new lens now. And that's just a really cool experience. I just want to say that on the front end. I'm sure that goes for all of us. In terms of the actual methods, like I said, I will try to do this succinctly and kind of talk about all of the projects in kind of an umbrella way, because they are really, really similar in the way that they're done. So I think most of the listeners will be familiar with the kind of the traditional hierarchy of evidence. So a meta-analysis is simply taking all of the available studies on a given topic, summarizing those quantitatively, and coming to some sort of mathematical conclusion, and ultimately that has some qualitative interpretations along with it. However, what most people are familiar with are what I will call just pairwise meta-regressions or contrast-based meta-regressions. There's a couple different meta-analyses, sorry. Already mixing up the terminology there, which is essentially a way that you can look at a question categorically. So we have two types of interventions, let's say intervention A versus intervention B. We take the difference between them, and then we summarize that across studies to see where does the weight of the evidence lie. Just as a basic example, obviously our most recent example would be the per session volume question. Let's say we have higher per session volumes versus lower per session volumes. Where does the evidence generally lean when we compare that across studies? That's how essentially most meta-analyses in our field are done. And those are really, really helpful because they do a few things. First and foremost, they make the comparisons within studies. So if you just think about the different studies in our field, they're going to have different exercise selection, different training status, different training interventions entirely. And we're making those comparisons within study, which most of those things are going to be controlled if the study is done in an appropriate fashion. So we're basically able to wash out all of that noise and try to really detect the signal. And that's what meta-analysis is designed to do. We have all these small studies typically are going to be used with a small number of participants. Usually the effects we're targeting are really, really small. So our studies are going to be usually woefully underpowered to detect the effects that we're actually interested in. So that's where meta-analysis really shines. We're able to collect all of these studies together and really help us tease out the signal from the noise and give us a better look as we kind of take a bird's eye view. That's meta-analysis in general. Now, the one limitation from those contrast-based meta-analyses, and the forest plot is kind of the visual a lot of people have when they think meta-analysis, and that's kind of what I'm talking about here. The one limitation of those is that for questions that are not categorical in nature, they leave a little bit to be desired. So when you're talking about volume, when you're talking about proximity to failure, when you're talking about frequency or the load on the bar, the percentage of 1RM, any of these questions in reality is actually a dose response question, or it's a question of a continuous variable. And so that's essentially what these projects kind of stirred from, starting with proximity to failure, was, hey, we know most of the meta-analyses on this topic have looked at this question categorically. And that's really, really helpful to give us a kind of a general direction on this question. However, there are some limitations of categorizing a continuous variable. So if you think about again, intervention A versus intervention B, the problem is higher volumes are not all created equal, right? In terms of the higher volume bucket, well, I could have a study with 10 versus 5 sets. I could have a study with 20 versus 2 sets. And there's a bunch of different volumes within each one of those buckets that we're really not able to then go further and look at the differences between. And that's where looking at things in a continuous dose response fashion is really, really helpful, because we can tease out the entire way that that relationship is going to look on the meta-analytic level. And so that's essentially what the genesis of these projects were: taking proximity to failure, weekly volume, weekly frequency, and then most recently per session volume. And we're going to meta-analyze these in a way that allow us to gain more information on the overall dose response relationship with each one of these variables. The only major difference between the projects, I would say, is that this is where I would say Josh and Jake both have the upper hand to the original project that I did, was that they actually have the information reported adequately in each study to actually analyze the information in the first place. Whereas what the proximity to failure project had to do was take the information that we had available. Just as a basic example, let's say a study says that they performed 3 sets of 8 reps with 70% of 1RM. The proximity to failure of that protocol is essentially unknown. So we had to go through a series of systematic estimation procedures to actually derive the RAR so that we could then use that for the actual dose response analysis. And so I view the proximity to failure one obviously as hopefully it's a valuable contribution to the literature, but that one definitely does have an asterisk with it because of the fact that we had to estimate the variable that we want to know the dose response of in the first place. So there's kind of 2 steps of estimation of the variable we care about, but then also the entire secondhand process of the actual meta regression itself. And so that's really the simplest way to kind of explain the process. We get the studies, We kind of go through the process of extracting all the relevant information to be able to create these statistical models on the back end. And we look at a variety of different dose response relationships that could plausibly fit the data well. You have a linear relationship, you have nonlinear relationships. People definitely know in the case of volume an inverted U relationship. We looked at ways of quantifying all of those, and then we went through a procedure to compare those that in a way that's going to balance two things. It's going to balance fitting the data well, but it's also going to balance model parsimony, which is basically just the simplicity of the model. And so the reason that's important is because let's say I went all the way in the direction of model complexity. What that's going to do is it's called overfitting. So if I have a bunch of data points, and somebody could probably see this if you just type in overfitting on Google, the line's going to bend in all kinds of interesting different ways to fit every single one of those data points. But when we think about that, both from a physiological perspective or also our ability to make future predictions with new research, that's going to generalize very, very poorly because we're taking our sample of data that we have or the current number of studies that we have, and we're focusing our model entirely on that data and not really thinking prospectively in terms of what future data could show and making sure that those predictions that we're making are something that are generalizable in the future. And so that's where the simplicity aspect comes because generally speaking, simpler models are going to generalize that new data better. So having that balance of, hey, this fits our data really well, but it's also simple enough to make sense both conceptually and physiologically, but also generalize the new data as best as possible. And that's where we kind of went through the different shapes. Like I said, linear and nonlinear shapes, compared those for each one of these different outcomes and different projects that we were doing. And we saw the one that was kind of the best balance of those things. And we called that the best fit. That's the one you've probably seen on social media or in the publications. And those are the ones we kind of discuss as our main findings. Now, I could go on and on about more and more limitations and caveats with this entire process and each pit stop along the way. But I think that is probably the highest leverage things to talk about in terms of the process that we were performing for each one of these projects, obviously independently, and gives a good overview on kind of the methods utilized. But guys, I'll chime in if I miss anything.
Pretty good.
So nothing from you guys, which is fine. I think Zach did a fantastic job of kind of letting the listeners know as a bit of a reminder if they're not sure of what a meta-analysis, meta-regression is, that is what each of you guys did. And by the way, it's so nice to hear that you guys are pumped to be on here and do a roundtable. I hadn't even thought about reflecting on the old ones that I'd done with the doctors, Helms, Israel, and obviously Menno as well. And those were good times, a long time ago, like 2016 or something. So it's been a while. It's been too long. So it's great to have new blood on here to discuss these things and way more data, actually, because back then there wasn't anywhere near the amount of data we have now. And obviously, as Zach, you rightly said, the meta-analyses, meta-regressions are like top tier evidence in that sense, because it's not cherry picking individual studies. It's really looking at all of them and then looking at trends and trying to find kind of the signal through the noise, as you rightly put. And obviously, I think a really interesting caveat is the difference between your study and Josh's and Jake's here, where you were having to kind of guesstimate, I guess, people's proximity to failure based off, did you use velocity loss as well? Or am I making that one up? Yeah, to look at velocity loss.
I think we had 5 different buckets to kind of estimate methods, kind of depending on what was reported. But yeah, some of the studies reported velocity, some just the reps and the load utilized, some did report RAR, and then a couple other ones that I can't recall off the top of my head. But basically, whatever we had at our disposal to estimate it as accurately as possible, that's what we utilized.
And just to jump in here, it was very systematic, which I know you used that word before, Zach, but just to emphasize that. And I think that's a high level point, thinking back to the roundtables you had, Steve, in 2016 or 2017 or whatever, there's a lot less research and things have progressed up to this point quite a bit, which is awesome. But at the same time, I think if you're unacquainted with hypertrophy and strength research, I think it's still common to overestimate the amount of research we do have on a topic. And if you just think about a dose-response relationship, you really need at least 3 groups within a study to create a dose-response relationship, right? So if you were to have a group doing moderate volumes versus high volumes, that's an A versus B comparison. You would need a C group as well to better understand the dose-response relationship, whether that is linear, non-linear, or maybe sort of this inverted U sort of phenomenon. So as Zach outlined, the methods very well, the ultimate goal is to have our best estimation while accounting for different levels of clustering and different levels of variance. That's probably nothing we need to worry about right now, because of course different studies are going to have different training statuses of the participants. They might have different starting points in terms of muscle size or muscle strength, etc., to try to estimate the nature of that dose response relationship, because previous meta-analyses, especially when we had less research, like Zach said, are kind of binary in nature, or at least categorical, right? Which makes sense when you have less research, because trying to do a meta-regression and trying to look at these different model fits just doesn't make quite as much sense when you have when you have quite a bit less to go off of. But when you have what we have to go off of now, we can try to model this, because in the gym, the question isn't really high versus low volume in a binary or a categorical sense. The question is, what are the pros and cons of manipulating this variable and its changes on the outcome of interest? So when we talk about the art and science of program design, or the art and science of coaching, or the art and science of just training in general, this will help inform the science side. It's not really going to help inform the art side. So the science side, in my mind, is when we change variables, what can we generally expect in terms of the outcome of interest? Basic example, Zach's best fit model for proximity to failure and its impact on hypertrophy outcomes suggests that as you get closer and closer to failure, you see about a linear improvement in hypertrophy. So there doesn't seem to be magic effects of going all the way to failure. There also doesn't seem to be a huge negative effect of going all the way to failure. So you can keep that concept in mind and then apply that on the art side of things. And that's something that I just don't think research can necessarily inform.
Yeah, I think that. Sorry,
Really
go
quick
for
on
it,
that
Jake.
same note. And we've all talked about this in separate places and stuff, and probably all on here as well. But just emphasizing, like Josh said, there, like just the general concept and the shape of the relationship and that sort of thing, rather than getting bogged down in specific numbers, and how that to me is probably the biggest takeaway in terms of informing the art of program design, like Josh was saying. The direction, to some degree, the magnitude and that sort of thing. But like, you know, the thing I keep seeing about the per session stuff is like, oh, we should do 11 sets per session. It's like, no, like think about the shape, and so yeah, I just wanted to underscore what Josh said there, because I think it gets lost in translation pretty easily, I think. And it almost, I think people feel like they should be able to get more than that out of the meta regressions, but not really, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting too when we kind of talk about these collectively, because I think that's where these projects and hopefully the utility of them really starts to shine. So I got like a thought experiment recently that was posed to me, and kind of asked the question between, should I train with one set to failure versus multiple sets with RAR? And we could go down a whole rabbit hole of that thought experiment. But the thing that it made me realize is that by having the conceptual nature of these dose response relationships, you're able to approximate an answer that's more than just, entirely off the cuff and experience based. As Jake said, I think you can get very lost in the weeds with kind of trying to derive exact numbers from these. Obviously, with quantitative information, there is a conclusion that you're going to draw from that on what is better than what. That's an obvious implication, but I think we all take the position that while that obviously is the case, and that's going to probably inform our quote unquote best guess on where you should start with your volume or your proximity to failure, et cetera, focusing on the qualitative nature of the dose response relationship is by far the goal of these projects, so that when you're in the gym and you're, more importantly, when you hit a plateau and you're making a change to your training to try to address that plateau, you can kind of have all of these conceptual dose response relationships in the back of your mind to figure out what is the highest leverage change that I can actually make and what may not be worth it in my given scenario.
Really well said. Yeah, I love that little discussion there. I think it also highlights like the differences between your meta-analyses. Also, is like your meta-analysis is only as good as the data that is within it, and the more data we get, the better it becomes. So it kind of improves over time and it becomes less noisy and kind of less messy. And also there could even be some kind of data within the meta-analysis that is better than other, like some studies are run better than others. It might be more informative to a certain population than another population. So you also can't kind of not have that. And so the ultimate thing that kind of you guys were just alluding to there is saying, hey, these don't give you black and white answers. It just gives you a sense of, okay, this is the direction that we think it's going, and it gives you clues and insights. And then you, through your own practice with your clients or yourself, you get better clue-ins to have what's going on in your own individual case study and scientific experiment there. So I think that was a great kind of just introduction to what meta-analyses are, how to use them, and what you guys kind of did. But I think probably useful to talk about, maybe just briefly summarize the results from each, just so people have like an understanding of that, and then we can talk about kind of the interaction. So if you want to start, Jake, with just the kind of big picture summary, do 11 sets.
Yeah, exactly. That's the optimal per session. Yeah. But so I don't think Zach touched on this too much. We talked about it in the other individual podcasts, but we quantified volume in different ways, right? So that matters a little bit here, although I'll keep it as general as possible. For the strength results, we found probably best to focus on like direct sets, meaning the same exercise as whatever you're trying to get strong at. So like bench press 1RM, count sets of bench press. Don't worry too much about other stuff. It still has a small impact, but it's not huge. And for that, we found the, in general, positive dose-response relationship. More sets gives you more maximal strength there. However, once you get to around 2 sets per session, it's very unlikely that doing additional sets is going to give you like a real measurable increase. And then hypertrophy, in this case, we're looking at not direct sets for that muscle group necessarily, but fractional. So counting indirect exercises as a half. Easy example being for the biceps, maybe curls count as a full set, but lat pull downs or rows count as a half in that case. And that's the 11 that we were talking about, where once you get above that 11, again, very unlikely we're going to see a measurable true difference that we can be really confident about beyond that.
Fantastic. Josh, what was the summary of your frequency and weekly volume?
Done. Easy.
Yeah.
Length and partials, right?
Yeah, this was evidence that clearly the authors of the weekly volume paper, led by myself and my awesome colleagues here, were just soft, and we think you should train with 10 RIR, because my favorite interpretation that I've come across, I try to spend minimal time on the internet, but this was sent to me. Basically, the claim was made that Robinson, absolute genius, and he actually understands how to train hard. But those other authors that did the weekly volume paper, they just, they don't know the first thing about training to failure.
Join the call, baby. Join the call.
And the content creator didn't understand that it was the exact same authors, or at least there was a ton of overlap, just in slightly different order in terms of the author list. So I'm glad we're doing this so we can kind of put the pieces together, if you will. But to summarize what those soft researchers did in the weekly volume paper is kind of the approach we took in terms of the manuscript. So the actual document itself that we wrote up is the general dose response relationship to resistance training and how that influences hypertrophy and strength outcomes. And the main way that we think about dose is volume, and you need to kind of choose an arbitrary timescale for quantifying that volume. And of course, Jake's is more focused on the individual session level, which has a very good conceptual basis. The weekly timescale is a little bit more arbitrary, but there's of course some value there, and it gives you another kind of lens to view things through. And also it makes sense to think about frequency on a weekly timescale. So therefore, that manuscript had both weekly volume and weekly frequency. So what we did is we had, in terms of the studies that we included, it was all of the studies that manipulated volume and or frequency. Okay, so just to make sure everyone's on the same page, that doesn't mean that the high volume groups in the volume meta-regression paper that we're talking about right now trained with lower RPE or higher RIR. Everything had to be the exact same except for those variables of interest, volume and or frequency. And what we did is we like Zach said, looked at the nature of the dose-response relationship between additional sets or additional frequency, and we looked at the independent effect of each of those variables. For hypertrophy, it was quite interesting, and I think you can look at it through a couple different lenses. On one hand, there was no clear inverted U, such that as additional sets were performed within the studies available, the hypertrophy didn't seem to kind of clearly taper off and kind of trend in the wrong direction, such that there's a clear overtraining effect that it took away from the hypertrophy that you got. So that's one way to view it: is, hey, there's no clear plateau and there's no inverted U. So, hey, there's a point in the column for high volume training paradigms. Another way of viewing the dose response between volume and hypertrophy that we found is that there was still pretty dang strong diminishing returns in terms of how much incremental hypertrophy you get as you increase volume throughout the week. So just as like a rough heuristic that I like to say to folks is, the initial sets you perform in a week, so going from like no training to the first, call it 5 to 10 sets per week, is about 3 times as potent in terms of the hypertrophy outcomes compared to, going from like 30 to 40 sets per week, right? So 30 to 40 sets, again, our best guess is there might still be something there. There's a lot more uncertainty up there, but nonetheless, again, we didn't find a clear plateau. But at the same time, I think you could easily view it through that lens of, hey, I get my best the best bang for my buck at those lower volumes. Also, these studies are 10 weeks long on average. I think it was like 10 and a half. A good amount of the studies only trained 1 to 3 muscle groups really hard. Sometimes participants were able to do whatever they wanted for other muscle groups. Sometimes they did have training programs for other muscle groups, but it was just a little bit easier. So with all that stuff in mind, I think you could easily, kind of conclude that, hey, there's plenty good reason to hang out in low to moderate volume ranges. But that was kind of the headline finding, because I think that's the one that people are most interested in. And it also provided some confirmation that we saw in previous meta-analyses regarding the effects of frequency on hypertrophy, because from more recent meta-analyses, call it like 2020 to 2024 range, we didn't see a very strong independent effect of additional frequency on hypertrophy outcomes. So if you're doing 10 weekly sets, is there a benefit of taking those 10 sets and doing, one session of 3 sets, another session of 3 sets, and then another session of 4 sets compared to just doing 5 and 5? It generally trended up, but it was quite variable, and we couldn't make any strong claims about like a clear independent effect of frequency and its contribution to hypertrophy. But maybe that's something we can get into a little bit later, because Jake's paper, at least the way that I conceptualize it, is looking at that same concept of frequency and how to kind of set up a microcycle or a training week just from a slightly different lens. And it's a great example of just science interpretation in general and how to keep in mind limitations of certain analyses and also the data sets that underlie them. For example, it turns out that a lot of the per session volumes within these volume studies tend to be pretty reasonable, right? So in other words, the data kind of clusters into per session volumes that you would kind of expect to see. So high level findings, dose response relationship was positive for volume and hypertrophy, but with pretty notable diminishing returns, but no clear plateau. Frequency didn't have a strong effect, although it was very slightly kind of leaned in the positive direction. And then for strength, it was kind of the opposite, such that additional frequency seemed to be a little bit more beneficial for strength gains. And then for volume's effect on strength gains, we saw that there's a very, very strong dose response. But once you got kind of to that 5 to 10 sets per week range, it kind of plateaued off, or at least the marginal benefit really started to decrease. So yeah, that's what we found, and I'm sure there's some threads we could pull on, but I'll kick it to you, Zach, regarding the proximity to failure findings.
Sweet. Yeah, so I'd say, like we discussed, mine definitely have more of a grain of salt to take with them. I just always like to reiterate when I discuss them that, like I said, the proximity to failure for each study was estimated. So there is a degree of ambiguity that we have in our confidence of those actual ratings before we even get to the findings. So it always is something we got to take with a grain of salt. But when looking at ours, the proximity to failure one, pretty simple and straightforward for hypertrophy. There tended to be greater increases in muscle size as you took sets closer to failure. It was a relatively modest slope, meaning it's not a massive difference, but it is something that we can detect, meaning that as we get closer to failure, the per set stimulus is kind of what I like to say does tend to increase. For strength, essentially the exact opposite. The line was totally flat, indicating that here's an important caveat: at a given load, so basically at a given percentage of 1RM, there doesn't seem to be a benefit of taking a set closer to failure. So the way you can think about that is if I have a 10 RM on the bar for strength, doing a set of 5 versus a set of 10 doesn't seem to be substantially different for strength gains, and that's probably because of the principle of specificity. In terms of hypertrophy, though, from that same kind of conceptual angle, while we can go into the far end of the weeds, and I think this is on the outline of moderator analyses and kind of trying to dissect the dose-response relationship further based on the heterogeneity between studies, one thing that did seem to kind of make sense conceptually from the hypertrophy perspective was that the relationship did seem to be impacted by the load that was used. So the heavier that you're training, so lower rep ranges, think your squats, your multi-joint lower body training lifts, and some upper body as well, those seem to be less benefited by closer proximity to failure. The relationship is still there, meaning it's still kind of the same graded relationship as you get closer to failure. Like the concept doesn't change, but it does seem to be modified by the load in which you're using. So typically, you probably, that makes sense for people who have trained in the gym. Your heavy lower body or heavy multi-joint lifts probably don't stand to gain as much from proximity to failure as some of the lighter isolation type exercises you're usually going to perform for higher reps. I'm going to resist of going off a tangent about moderator analyses and how that may be limited, but that's generally the concept that we saw, which again, does have that asterisk with it in terms of the estimations of the proximity to failure that we did have to make in order to kind of justify that. I've since looked at the data set in a couple different ways I'm always just kind of interested in how we could have maybe done that a little bit better in post hoc. That was the first project that we did in kind of this scope and how we could have adjusted some things. I've looked at it in terms of the relative percentage of the reps possible. So to put that in a easier way to understand, every set, depending on how many reps you do and how many reps you could do, there's a percentage of the possible reps that you've completed. And so that's a different way to kind of look at the same relationship, but long story short, it's relatively similar in terms of looking at it that way. It's a little bit different for strength, but this is a hypertrophy podcast, so I'll refrain from going into that too much. But for hypertrophy, it was relatively similar, which I think is just good to see in terms of the stability of the relationship in terms of what we were finding. And so in terms of, I guess, one thing that's relevant there that we already mentioned in terms of the studies that were included, the goal of that project was to cast a really, really wide net. Proximity to failure is an interesting area because there's multiple bodies of literature that all impact it directly or indirectly. So we try to include all of those, and again, for statistical reasons that I'll refrain from going into too far, all of those pieces of heterogeneity are either directly or indirectly accounted for to make sure none of that noise is impacting the relationship too much. So we included, obviously the failure and non-failure studies, the velocity loss studies that you mentioned, some studies that were looking at different types of like cluster sets and rest redistribution, some studies that were directly reporting RAR. And I think there was one more bucket. I probably should remember this, but it has been a while. So it was multiple different bodies of literature to try to get those number of studies that were included as high as humanly possible, because it is going to take quite a few studies to kind of detect this relationship. But that was kind of the headline findings from that project.
Super interesting, guys. And actually, it's funny you mentioned it just there, where this is a hypertrophy podcast. You guys touched on the strength elements of your studies as well. But just on that thought, it's never really been something that I've taken home from each of these meta-analyses. But as you each went through it and were talking through, hey, this was the kind of effect for hypertrophy, this was the effect for strength, it just immediately made me think how so many people think that these styles of training are so closely tied together, and how you could train for strength and hypertrophy and maybe even combine them, and they're pretty synergistic in nature. And I think there are ways to do it where it could be, but from listening to each of the results there, like the actual differences between if you really want to focus on strength versus really focus on hypertrophy, like it's not opposite, but the relationships were very different. I don't know if you're all nodding, so I guess you all felt that too.
The one caveat I will say, which I think is just absolutely crucial to highlight in the case of strength, is that's talking in the time frame of the studies that were included. So it's somewhere in the range of 6 to 16 weeks typically. And for anyone that's listening that's ever dabbled with strength-oriented programming, you're probably thinking that pretty much every program that you can find online is kind of in that range. And that's typically going to be more so in kind of the final stages of like a strength preparation, right? So we're not talking if I had 52 weeks, how I should train. It's more so in that final kind of typically 8-week period, those final 2 blocks into competition or into testing, how should I train? And so I think you're spot on to say that it's an important finding from all these kind of projects that, and another one you could add to is the percentage of 1RM or the rep ranges we're training with. Pretty much any single one of the primary variables that you're looking at seems to have a divergent dose response relationship to some degree between what has been found to optimize hypertrophy and optimize strength in the time period of the studies included, which again has additional caveats. And I don't want to harp on that too much because I think a lot has been made of the disagreement between the findings for particularly Josh's paper. That is a massive can of worms that I don't want to open too much. It's that
Come
that
on,
could
man,
take over
let's
this
do it.
entire I mean, yeah, it's I don't think that's how I would personally view the results for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
But long story short, Steve, I think you're extremely correct in picking up on the fact that, again, in the timeframes of the studies that we do have, the way in which to maximize these adaptations does seem to diverge a good amount. And I don't think that's going to impact the results for most of people that are trying to combine these things. But I think if you're getting to your level or people that are really trying to push the envelope and time either one of these adaptations, I think that definitely is something to take note of and probably influences program design a good amount.
Yeah, I think that caveat of the length of study is very important because there will be people also being like, oh, but I thought like beating the logbook and seeing strength progressions, that was like as a natural, one of the most objective ways to know that we're improving. It's like, well, but not if you're just kind of playing with neurological adaptations and reducing fatigue and like almost peaking yourself to see that it's going to be very short term in nature, just like you mentioned, this is short term. So that's well said. Josh, you had a point to make, sorry.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I'll just add one more limitation, and that is that a lot of the studies use strength assessments that are rather novel to the individuals. So if you just think of like a pie chart of what over the course of an 8 to 10 week study, what would drive someone's strength up when they haven't done this strength assessment before, it's probably not going to be going from 3 to 4 sets per session, but instead it might be showing up another day in the lab in order to practice that strength assessment. Hence, maybe that's why we saw an effective frequency for strength outcomes. And it's hard to say that is like a primary reason or it's not a reason, but that at least makes sense in my head. And there's going to be times where you think about some of those limitations, and then as a practitioner or as an athlete, you do or don't like kind of follow the evidence. But just to be like fully transparent, I think truly for a well-trained powerlifter or someone interested in strength goals of some kind, I think the dose response relationship between volume and strength gains is going to be stronger up to higher volumes than we see. But I also can't put my scientist hat on and tell you exactly why that's the case. And I also can't say that is the case. That could be a blind spot. So I think with all those factors,
Do you think that's influenced by the time scale you're talking about, though?
Yeah. I think time scale is definitely a massive one. I'm just adding into the conversation here the novelty of the strength assessment as another one. And I also think that's an interesting thought experiment regarding hypertrophy stuff, because it's easy for us to kind of do this mental gymnastics regarding strength outcomes and why we might kind of change our actual practical recommendations from the dose responses. But we do that a little bit less with hypertrophy. And there's been a lot of discussion about like edema or swelling or the type of muscle size assessment. how long from the end of the training protocol, so the last workout, and the assessment. At the end of the day, we just don't have a ton of answers there. So I do think it's worth just bearing in mind that we are using outcomes that we measure in labs with laboratory techniques and technology that we have access to that we don't have all the answers to. So I know that's maybe not like the most exciting thing to hear on a podcast, but I do think it's worth just keeping in the back of your mind that like these are by no means the final say. And one thing that could really, really shake things up is if we learn something about these measurement techniques for muscle size that are like, oh, we kind of need to rethink that. And we could get into the validation of ultrasound against MRI, which we're probably a little bit more confident in. We could get into the, kind of this contradiction between, hey, you need to wait long enough after the final training session to reduce swelling, but also muscle size decreases very quickly within a given training week, which is kind of like impossible to kind of square that circle. So there's a lot of there's a lot of moving parts here, and I think it's worth keeping those limitations in mind at a minimum.
Jake, I know you have something.
Just one last thing on the strength front, and then we'll stop railroading your podcast for powerlifters. The other thing I've been trying to talk about and keep in mind is the level of specificity of these training studies was not super high. Like the average rep range was like 10. And we quantified the number of sets per week and sets per session that were like less than 6 reps or used greater than 85% 1RM, and it was very few. And so when I think about that, and I'm like, well, maybe that's part of why in practice we might change like the actual program writing for somebody and use slightly higher volumes. And because when I initially saw that, I was like, man, would more specific on average strength training like make the dose response even more clean? Like is it actually 1 set or something, right? Rather than 2 per session. But then I was like, well, if that effect is mostly driven by this very low level of specific strength training, if we had more of that, maybe the dose response would extend beyond what it does. So that's what I've been thinking about. Maybe that's part of why some of those practical changes are a little bit different.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's just a great discussion surrounding you guys can only talk about what the data's given you. Yeah, you can't talk about more than that outside of like it's your anecdotal experience or like what have you, and therefore that is a limitation. It's what data set you have in front of you and the limitations of that. And I think we spoke about this on our podcast, Jake, together, where Eduardo de Souza is doing like the edema study. I think he's calling it. It's probably got a much more eloquent title than that, but I think he's investigating that effect because that's going to have effects across like so many studies, and so that'll be very, very interesting to kind of garner there. And obviously you guys have already talked about some of the limitations. I don't know if there's any other big limitations that spring to mind that you think are worth the listeners knowing about. You named kind of the length of training, obviously like other training they're doing. Some of the studies, I guess, will probably be like in subject design versus like between subjects. That's probably one.
Yeah.
Don't know if there's any other big ones for you guys that you really want to highlight and bring up.
I'll take a stab at like an umbrella comment, and then maybe the guys might have a couple more specific points here. But I think, Steve, you already mentioned this, but I think it's just crucial to outline that pretty much anything in the area of meta science is descriptive in nature. It's ultimately it's limited to the data or the information that's ultimately going into the model that we're aiming to estimate. So you hammered on that perfectly, but I think that's crucial for people to understand because that's what makes all of us so much more confident in the generality of the dose response relationship and kind of thinking about them conceptually rather than the specific numbers. So just to give as a basic example, so someone may raise a couple of the points that even you had in the outline. The training status, the exercise selection, the rep ranges, the motivation of the participants, all of these things, which are all absolutely valid concerns. So I'd say 2 things there. So one, the comparisons that contribute to this dose-response relationship are made within study. That's the first thing. So that's kind of like what Josh was talking about with the clustering of the data within studies and things like that. That's the first thing to note is that theoretically, as long as the data was collected in a way that equalizes those variables across groups outside of the variable that we're interested in, that comparison remains valid at the levels of those things. But beyond that, between studies, those would have to be like systematically differing factors for it to bias our ability to kind of detect the signal here. So, and that's where those moderator analyses are helpful, in the sense of saying, is there anything here that is so clearly an issue that we need to discuss it? But if you just think about exercise selection, rep ranges, like those things that I mentioned, for the most part, those are kind of normally distributed differences between studies that, some studies are going to use better exercises, some studies are going to use worse, some studies are going to use higher rep ranges, lower rep ranges. All of that heterogeneity, one of the assumptions of the model is that it's essentially following a normal distribution. And again, that's handled in the back end, and then we're trying to see throughout that and among that heterogeneity, what's that signal and what's that conceptual nugget that we can derive from these things to actually help us inform these things in practice. Now, with that said, if we do go to some of these variables that do differ between studies, like the exercise selection, the rep ranges, that doesn't mean that that's not going to influence the exact numbers that you're going to want to prescribe for a given individual based on their training program. It almost certainly will. It's just that the conceptual nature of the dose-response relationship seems relatively stable among those factors, at least with the data that we have access to. One thing I'll note is that a lot of these relationships, so these moderating factors that we're interested in, just as an example, let's talk about proximity to failure for the volume papers. I think that's a good one, kind of combining all these papers together. If I train closer to failure, do I need less volume than I train farther away from failure? In order to have really, really confident answers to those questions, we need a study that directly investigates that question. So you would essentially need 4 groups. You need a group training close to failure, far from failure, both with high volumes, and then close to failure, far from failure, both with low volumes. That's the direct way to answer that question. Now, we can still get that causal effect for that question from a data aggregation or a meta-analysis type project, but that would almost need to be the entire focus of that paper to make sure that we're teasing out that variable appropriately. Here's one of the examples that I like to give to kind of demonstrate this, like how much of a headache this is to derive between studies. One of the most popular things that people kind of talk about in the volume literature is the fact that the volume relationship is dependent upon the rest period. That's like super, super commonly said. Just think about this conceptually for a second. You're a researcher, right? I have a high volume study that I am designing. What kind of rest periods are you going to pick in terms of the available rest periods that you think are reasonable to design your study so that you and your understaffed classmates are able to complete the data collection? You're obviously going to pick lower rest periods, right? And so when we look at that in the data set, I can't remember it exactly, but I believe there's a relatively strong correlation between the volumes utilized and the lower the rest period. So I can't remember what it is exactly. There's something there in terms of like making that a little bit foggier. Even if that wasn't the case, the point remains. But you can see how those factors can start to get foggy when you think about some of those things. And so when we try to investigate that relationship across studies, you need to think about all of these, this constellation of variables that could be influencing the thing that you want to know. And that's why the inclusion criteria of only including the studies that isolate these variables is really, really important. And that's where the moderated analyses are the by definition exploratory, and that cannot be underlined enough. And so that's where some of these moderating questions are really, really interesting. And we want to know about those because those obviously have really big practical effects or practical influence, but it is really tough to do that when we have 1, maybe 2 studies that investigate that kind of comparison directly. And so that's where you have to have a little bit more of that practitioner view to understand these things conceptually in the background, and then just make logical extrapolations to make sure you kind of take that into account in your programming. But guys, I don't know, I went old man and yelling from the porch on that one.
I just really quick on that final note. I was hanging out with my coach Ryan a couple weeks ago now. He was asking me about the procession paper, and I was explaining to him the results and some of the limitations and whatever. And he just looked at me. He was like, "Bro, didn't we already know this?" And I was like, "Yeah." Like, so like that's the funny thing to me is that it's awesome to have this data and to have these papers, but at the end of the day, it's just like nothing really should change. Like if this drastically changes how you program, that's kind of weird to me. Like at the end of the day, it should be something that makes some reasonable amount of sense. You try it, see what the results are like, get the feedback from the client, how fatigued are they, etc., and you adjust things over time. It's like you don't have to know exactly what these metas found, right? If you keep the directionality in mind, like you guys are saying, and like we said before, that helps you make some of those adjustment decisions. But it's like I don't know, like this shouldn't be a groundbreaking thing to me. It always just comes back to talking to the person, I think.
Josh, you got a
Here's
point?
a perspective on that. Yeah, I think I agree directionally with that and what like Ryan's comment was there. At the same time, I've noticed that when you look back at things with the benefit of hindsight and with the benefit of the knowledge you have now, things seem like they were obvious all along, right? Because, think back to what we were going off of, or what you were going off of, Steve, with the folks in the roundtables in 2016 and 2017 about volume. Think about how at that time, if we got a meta regression that showed a very clear inverted U, someone might look back at that and say, we knew that all along. So I think like Ryan, like I think like Ryan's I love his content, by the way. Yeah, go for it, Jake.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think that's a fair point, and I would agree. But to me, it's more about the like those first handful of sets are the biggest bang for your buck, and then it kind of gradually tapers off. And then, like, I think we would all agree, if somebody is just run into the dirt and they cannot recover, it doesn't make sense to do more volume. Whether it actually leads to more growth or not, it just is unsustainable. So it wouldn't like fundamentally change how you program in that case, right?
Yeah, I think maybe it's kind of the where I know we overlap, Jake, in terms of our perspective on this is probably the reason why you might cap things. We can kind of confirm it's probably going to be a little bit more on the practical side of things, as opposed to this elusive physiological reason by which, you do additional work or you just train harder in general, you train closer to failure, and now you're going to automatically get worse results. That very well could happen, but maybe not for the reasons some people speculated, earlier on. So that's kind of my perspective on things. I think like there's so many, like we could list off dozens of limitations about this, and if anything, it's created more questions than answers, which is exciting. We've rattled off some of the big hitters here in terms of the kind of different dose responses between hypertrophy and strength, edema, maybe specialization programs versus more balanced programs, the specificity of the training program for strength, like Jake said. We could go on and on and on. So, these are by no means the final say. These are by no means not going to change. They're absolutely going to change as we get more data, or maybe someone comes along and, they have a suggestion regarding statistical approaches, et cetera. So I almost like to think even one level higher than these dose response relationships, because these are very conceptual in nature to understand the qualitative thing that we're seeing. But I like to go even one level higher than that and think about what is the concept present amongst all three of these papers. So to me, I think it's pretty clear that for hypertrophy training, you should probably train pretty dang hard, and you should probably do a lot of it. And like Jake was basically just getting at, and like I was just saying a second ago, you're probably not going to run into this like elusive inverted U, such that even if you're doing pretty well and everything is sustainable, but if you were to cut your volume in half, you would actually get better results. I think we can have some confirmation that, to Ryan's point, we kind of knew all along that you need to train hard, even though people hypothesize to the alternative, right? And that's how I think about it, is even one level higher up. And then on the strength side of things, I think this is just amazing confirmation of the power of specificity. Because if you think about the concept of specificity and maximal force production being ultimately what you're testing when you're doing a strength assessment, that aligns pretty dang well with the general qualitative nature of the dose responses. So I think there's common ground there when you kind of even go one level higher than that. And that can also be applied to, I think, other training variables as well. Of course, you would want confirmation. There's, of course, more to learn. But I think kind of the umbrella topic is where my head goes.
some people may have experimented with their own training or with clients and noticed this inverted U phenomenon, right? And to me, I could totally see how that would be the case if you're doing tons of volume that's kind of lower quality, right? Like your technique's not that great, you're not training that close to failure, you're doing all these things, and all of a sudden you cut your volume back, but your quality goes way up. I could totally see your outcomes being better in that case, right? So I can see how people might feel that they're experiencing that phenomenon. That's just another reason or another example of this data is just based on the studies that we have, right? Like this isn't necessarily saying what reality is. It's just the data that we have, and like we're controlling for those things in the studies, right?
I think people honestly massively underestimate the lab effect too. I think that just plays such an underlined role in terms of like all this stuff, in terms of the, the constant encouragement to adhere to the protocol, but also push through those things that if you're by yourself in the gym and your legs are super sore, it's just harder. Even if you know that you're relatively consistent with your RAR accuracy, things like that. I think the lab effect plays quite a big deal, but I think that's a benefit in the sense that I think very similar to what Josh is kind of saying is like I kind of view the practical and the kind of like high level stimulus side of the equations like pretty differently in my head. Like I think the research is, obviously with the limitations in mind, I think it's really good to help us understand that quasi conceptual nature of the stimulus side of the equation. But when you remove the lab effect and you remove all of these aspects of the hyper controlled environment that kind of encourage people and help people to adhere to the protocols that 52 sets of quads, jokes aside, like that's gnarly training. I don't doubt it personally, because I'm assuming I know what goes into the experience with the participants there to help them get through that and help them complete that. But without that might be less realistic in the gym. And so again, like Josh is saying, you're capping your prescriptions in the real world for potentially different reasons. That doesn't make them not valid, and it doesn't make them not important. That's the crucial aspect of coaching a client or coaching yourself, is being realistic with your practical limitations and constraints. If I can't sleep 8 or 9 hours, doesn't matter what I do. That is an important roadblock that needs to be considered when I'm programming for myself. Those kind of practical limitations, that's where the art of coaching comes in, and being able to recognize those things. Whereas the papers, I think, are helpful to kind of conceptualize that stimulus side of the equation, so we can kind of do the back of the napkin kind of calculus in our heads of like, what's the highest lever that I can pull right now for me to break a plateau or handle this roadblock that I'm currently dealing with, if the stimulus side of the equation is what we feel like we're lacking. And I think that's really the way that I view it. And I think the more that we discuss this in kind of this collective fashion, I really just realize how these individual papers are cool and helpful, but they're even more helpful collectively, because then we can start to weigh these different relationships to help us deal with these problems even more. And I'm not even talking about it necessarily quantitatively. I think you have to be aware of that, because obviously if one relationship far outweighs another relationship, but in terms of like the variance explained, I think these are all roughly similar in terms of the totem pole. And so I think it's helpful to be able to compare those across variables so that we can make these kind of collectivist decisions when we do reach that fork in the road with somebody's training on, any given applied scenario.
A thought that comes to mind, guys, from this discussion is people might be, you've probably all heard it, where someone will say like their preference is for higher intensities, and therefore they train with lower volumes because to be able to recover from it, that's what is required. And they'll almost say that is just as good as training maybe with some reps in reserve and train with higher volumes. And so it's a case of like, pick your poison to hard. There's many roads to Rome, as I like to say. Do we think collectively that is true, where it's a case of you can just pick your preferences of where you go? Or do we think there is some intersection of these variables where actually if you go a little further from failure, you can pull on that volume lever a bit more and maybe maximize growth? I guess we don't have answers there yet, but I guess conceptually, is that something that you're still feeling, or are you actually just like, hey, actually, I think if you pull on one a bit more than the other, then it makes up for it somehow? Don't know if anyone has some strong thoughts. Go for it, Jake.
All right. So for me, obviously, like you said, there's no clear-cut answer, right? Um, where my head goes is basically how confident am I in what data that we have? And as Zach has been very clear since day one, there's a lot of estimations in the RIR meta, right? Um, Not that I don't think it's awesome. It's just I have slightly less confidence in that compared to something that doesn't have as many estimations. So if I have to choose, I personally tend to lean a bit more towards the volume side, maybe a little bit further from failure, if that does indeed make a big difference in how much volume they can do. I have experimented with this with some clients and myself, and some people do have that experience where if they're training closer to failure, it really sabotages how much volume they can do. Maybe I shouldn't say sabotage, that has a negative connotation, but really affects how much volume they can do. Whereas other people, we typically what I've done is pull volume back just a little bit, go closer to failure, run that for 2-3 weeks, whatever, how are we feeling? And usually, the first week or two, maybe there's a bump in fatigue, but then you kind of get used to it, right? A lot of people have had that experience. And so then we can say like, okay, well, you've gotten used to it. Your recovery is really good. Your performance is great. Let's try to add a setback in or something, right? And we've kind of gotten to this place where maybe now we're at a similar volume but closer to failure. And now we can even get to a slightly higher volume because that failure just wasn't, the fatigue demon isn't as scary as we thought it was, right? I found that a bunch of times. Not always, of course, but anyway, that's kind of been my experience. Is that I tend to lean a little bit more towards the volume side if I have to choose. But I've sometimes found that I don't have to choose. Sometimes we can bump both of them up and things go fine.
Yeah, I
Josh.
I think you nailed that, Jake. And I think um, the answer is probably both. High volumes and training to or close to failure, but then you just kind of scale back one or both of those as needed. And I would just emphasize again the qualitative differences between our best guess for proximity to failure and our best guess for volume. For volume, the volume you're missing out on is still in kind of a low volume range. So if training to failure knocks you from 12 sets per week down to 7 sets per week, you're probably going to miss out on a decent bit there, just because those initial, just kind of, this is kind of hand wavy, so don't read too much into the numbers, but those initial 0 to 15 sets are going to be way more potent than sets 15 to 30, right? So if you have to choose one and you're in low volume and you're already in a low volume range, you should probably lean into the volume side of things. I think that might kind of flip as you get into higher volumes. If you have to choose one and you're not already training to failure, probably just go ahead and train to failure, which I think aligns pretty much with exactly what Jake was saying. But I also think that sometimes the different variables can have different independent effects in terms of the experience of training, the nature of the fatigue. Sometimes the loading demands shift, especially if it's a compound exercise. And that's also worth keeping in mind. So, again, we can, as scientists, kind of inform the input and expected output side of things if all things were held equal, but it's never going to tell you exactly what to do because that's not the case in practice. So you kind of need to have those qualitative relationships in mind and basically just layered in with practical things, because I don't think we have strong evidence that you need to avoid fatigue at all costs. I don't think we have strong evidence that if you have one without the other, that you're going to completely miss the mark in terms of generally moving in the right direction in terms of hypertrophy.
Zach,
Yeah,
any final thoughts?
I obviously agree with what both the guys said for the most part. And in terms of my biggest piece of advice for people interpreting our papers, but also just further meta science in general and kind of taking them into the gym, I think the biggest piece of advice that people kind of miss when they actually go to apply this to their own programming is that they are thinking about applying the information and the implied nature of these relationships on a completely different time scale than what is intended by the research. So as we've said multiple times, the research is 6 to 16 week studies, somewhere in the 8-week range on average. That is a completely different application than what people think about this in terms of like, all right, starting a program on Monday. This is my program for the next 52 weeks. Let's get after it. You know what I mean? So I view it personally as like we have all these variables. We understand their, rough relative weights and their directionalities and their shapes. How can I maximize the stimulus over the course of a calendar year? And so that's the way that I generally like to think about these programming principles. And so essentially with anything, if you are writing the polar ends of these relationships for pretty much any variable, that's probably going to have some negative downstream effects if you actually try to expand this out to a longer time scale than just the 8 weeks in which the participants were able to kind of crawl through the finish line for some studies, right? So when you think about volume, am I going to be blasting 30 to 40 sets per muscle group all year long? Probably not. And so then you have to think about things like fatigue management strategies like intro weeks and deloads, and am I ramping my volumes? And then the same goes for proximity to failure. Am I going to take every single set, including multi-joint exercises, including free weight movements, to failure because the theoretical stimulus is greater? Obviously not. That's not sustainable. And so I think I zoom out and I say, okay, the goal here is to kind of maximize the stimulus on a calendar year basis. And based on the overall direction of the research, like we have all said, the fatigue boogeyman, assuming, and I'll make the caveat, I don't necessarily agree with it, but assuming the swelling and our measurements are intact and we can derive, valid and useful inferences from this data, I think we can, but let's just make that caveat. Then I'm just trying to, pick a pretty good spot on these dose response curves that allows me to maintain that over the course of the year and accumulate my stimulus as high as I possibly can, because that kind of seems to be the name of the game when it comes to hypertrophy. So for me, I think that pretty naturally leads to, most of the time trying to get to moderate to high volumes on the weekly end of the spectrum and trying to be on the moderate high end of the proximity to failure spectrum. You can mix and match those in multiple different organizations based on preferences, based on maybe even just time availability and things like that, and probably come to similar kind of net stimulus over the course of a year. And I think those are all valid approaches, but I think the thing that we can all collectively agree on, and I really like Josh's framing of like, okay, we have the exact numbers from these papers, then we have the conceptual nature of the dose response relationships, but then we have the even higher point of like, guys, fatigue isn't going to kill you. And trying to push that stimulus up for the most part seems to be a good thing. I think that just kind of directionally leads you to a helpful spot, along with the principle of like trying to maximize any one variable is probably going to come with costs at some point throughout a calendar year. And so I think just using that principle in general allows for a helpful kind of framework to make decisions when you're actually writing a program down, rather than just saying, okay, here's what the latest meta-analysis says, let's take that into the gym and run with it. You're more so thinking about it in terms of like, okay, here's what these are all saying directionally. How do I maximize this kind of net stimulus under the curve? And what does that mean for me in terms of a sustainable recipe that I can continue to execute at a high level? I completely avoided the question that was actually, the stem of this. And I'm trying to think about if I have a good answer that dovetails off this nicely. But I would say in general, I would tend to agree with Josh's point. I think that the bottom end of the volume relationship is really, really aggressive, and the proximity to failure relationship seems to be modest, and, it's there, but it's not like a super, super strong effect by any means. And I think that points to Jake's point, not only that the data has some estimations with it that gives us a little bit of pause in terms of the confidence. If we go back to all the other meta-analyses on proximity to failure that are a little bit more binary in nature, none of them, to my knowledge, except maybe like one or two odd subgroup analyses, have found that failure is significantly better than non-failure. I think that's for a variety of reasons, but I don't think the difference between, 1 or 2 RAR and failure is absolutely massive. And I think Martin's study did a really good job looking at this too, and probably the highest quality data collection on this study. So I think there probably is this directional effect that training closer to failure is better, but I don't think it's like this night and day difference that you're going to completely be missing the forest for the trees if you don't. Like I said, I kind of view it all in this kind of collective stimulus bucket. So at the lower end of the volume pool, I'm probably going to prioritize volume. And then as we kind of get to that person's time investment cap, then probably try to increase the kind of the per set stimulus by proximity to failure to kind of maximize that time investment. And I think I massively overtalked, so I apologize.
No, I think that was really well said, and I liked that discussion a lot. I add to it by saying Jay Cutler never went to failure, and he was Mr. Olympia however many times, and so clearly that's the answer and the route to go down. That's my best approach at coming to
Well,
some
Mike
sort of
Menser,
joke
Steve.
after all of this. No, we can't bring up Mike. He was never Mr. Olympia, right? Or was he? I don't even actually know the history behind all of that. But anyway, he wore glasses like me, so very intelligent guy, sports scientist, all that good stuff. But I really like that discussion in terms of, hey, we don't want to go too extreme in any one direction. And if we are to lean into one more than the other as scientists, the volume research is a bit stronger in that regard. So that like sniper approach from Mike Mentor, one set to failure, like whatever it is, probably less reliable than an Arnold or Jay Cutler, like higher volume, maybe leaving a few in reserve. And but the saying I've said a few times on here is like, when I think about hypertrophy training, it's training as hard as possible, as often as possible, for as long as possible. And that sounds really like almost like a Greg Doucette, train harder than last time, sort of like, hey, just shout that to everyone. But when you conceptualize that and you think about what you said there, Zach, in terms of like trying to maximize almost the stimulus across the calendar year, stimulus comes with it inevitably fatigue, and you have to manage that somehow, whether or not that is pulling back on volume, intensity, utilizing deloads, having rest days, that sort of thing. It's part of it. Or even exercise selection, again, something that I wouldn't want people to take away from this. And some of the volume data, I'm sure you guys would agree, is, hey, yeah, more volume is better. And so they look at their program like, how can I maximize volume and number of hard sets for my quads? Oh, I'll just do leg extensions and not do any of these big compound lifts. It's like, that's not how you really want to utilize this. That's the limitation of the data. It doesn't kind of decipher different exercises and that sort of thing. But there's no getting around training hard for hypertrophy. Like, you need to feel pretty beat up now and then. If you're not, then that's a problem. And I think that's probably why those kind of stimulus proxies became very popular within bodybuilders notoriously, in terms of like pump, disruption, soreness, why there might be utility in using those to help auto-regulate programming to some extent as well. So you can kind of get those going as well within the programming and help you auto-regulate. And I think that comes down to understanding yourself, your body. It takes a while. So I think for the more advanced trainees who look at these meta-analyses and trying to utilize them within their coaching, I think, like you said, Jake, it's probably not going to change much to what they're already doing. But for the more novice people within their programming who would benefit from having some sort of guidance, that's where these meta-analyses give coaches a really good tool set for them, for their clients, and then also for like that normal novice lifter who probably they could pick up a Jeff Nippard program and do really well because it's taking into consideration these sort of things. Josh, you have a point, I think.
Yeah, my biggest fear when disseminating this is that people would experience FOMO regarding like not training with very high volumes, because I think that can have a net negative in terms of actually your long-term volume under the curve, as Zach described. I also think that sometimes it's just not possible to, if someone is constrained to 3 or 4 or even 5 sessions a week, to actually have enough capacity for focus throughout that entire time and to train with high quality. And then the next thing you know, sure, you're at an RP9 or an RP10, but if that exercise was placed earlier in the session because you're doing these monster 3-hour sessions and trying to get into the most optimal volume ranges, now, there's just a bunch of that's probably the best description of junk volume I could give. So the point I want to make here is that while I think all 4 of us would say, hey, within these constraints of research, when things are pretty well controlled and over short timescales, and sometimes lean more on the specialization side of things, high stimulus seems to be good. Like you said, Steve, train as much as you can, as often as you can, as long as you can, or something like that. I absolutely think that's true. At the same time, that you can part is absolutely massive, and that can manifest into low to moderate volumes, and that's the case for me. And I think that's okay. And upon reflection of, okay, if I think about a power lifter or someone interested in physique improvements that I've worked with, what is the best predictor for the magnitude of their outcomes? It's probably not their training volume. It's probably not whether they train with 2 RAR on average or 0 RAR on average. I think it's things that get them on the dartboard as opposed to getting a little bit closer to the bullseye, if that makes sense. Because, these things probably make a difference for you, Steve, now that you're trying to really eke out as much as you can before your next competitive season. And therefore, you want to give yourself the edge and really make sure you're nailing this within your constraints. But like you said, for someone in the first 5, 6, 7 years of their training career, it's probably not this make or break thing by any means. I don't think the evidence would support that. A saying I like to come back to when it comes to research in general is the one thing we can be very confident in is that progressive training works. A lot of these other things, even if it is something where we have a decent amount of research like volume, there's still just a lot of uncertainty. And I think that's why someone like you, Steve, or someone like Ryan Doris, who we've brought up a couple times, are going to land on these things that are pretty dang consistent across folks in these higher level concepts that, yeah, you got to do it for a really, really long time. And sure, you could do more, but you're probably going to see less benefit as you do more and more. And kind of just a experienced athlete or an experienced coach will be able to rank order those variables, I think, pretty dang well. And I think that's why, some people can look at these and they can be quite intuitive based on their experience, but hopefully by putting some numbers on them and kind of, talking about the methods that go into them can help really reinforce and give them some more confidence as well.
One other thing on that note, this is something that I'd be interested to hear what all you guys think about this too. I've struggled with this for quite some time, is that, we talk about, and this is even more reason I think to, as we've discussed in at length at this point, is like, what is the spirit of these meta-analyses, right? Like, what's the higher level application of them? Is that, I think about when we're going to make a change to someone's program and it's like, okay, we were doing 12 sets a week at 2 RIR on average, and now we're going to try 15 sets a week with 3 RIR, whatever the change is. How do we actually know if it worked better or worse in the real world, right? Because are all of the external variables the exact same? Probably not. If nothing else, it's a different time in your training career, right? You might just make less progress simply because you're more highly trained now than you used to be. So those comparisons are always really hard for me, and I think that's sometimes you can note, like sometimes you just know, right? Like somebody grows like a weed for 6 months and it's like, oh, okay, that worked, right? That's pretty rare in my experience. And I think that at the end of the day, this data is amazing for, as we've talked about, having a rationale for what things to try to adjust. But like, we're just not going to be able to see those little 0.5% differences. And so it's kind of like, man, for a lot of coaches, especially if you're not working with someone trying to win Mr. Olympia, it's like, have a program that makes sense and they can recover from and it's sustainable, and like, probably don't worry too much about getting too lost and all, oh, should I do this? I have FOMO about this or whatever? Like, it probably just doesn't matter that much. Like, you're not gonna be able to tell the difference, right? So I'm curious if any of you three have like had an epiphany about that.
Jake, you're not doing a good job of selling your coaching here. You've got the silver bullet somewhere, right? You've got the secret. I know you have. We all have, right?
I'm
trying to empathize. I'm trying to empathize with most people. I have the answers.
This is us just bringing as much strength back into the podcast as possible, because that's kind of a core theme of what we've been chatting about up to this point, is the differences in terms of the strength outcomes and the hypertrophy outcomes. And I'm very glad Jake brought that up, because I think that is a very, very common thing when it comes to proximity to failure and when it comes to volume, is that just do what works for you. And while I think there's some truth to that, I think the truth to that comes in kind of the practical realm in terms of your limits, right? In terms of like what you can actually sustain in terms of aches and pains, in terms of, not potentially experiencing some overreaching symptoms like sleep disruption or mood disruption or low motivation to train, things like that. But I think the do what works for you part of it is almost impossible to actually prove. I think there are some instances where you could make some decent conjecture, but I don't think I just highly doubt our ability to parse out whether, Steve, you go from 8 sets for your biceps for a year and then you bump it up to 16, whether the growth you got in those 2 individual years, if you could ever tell a difference. And I even think that's the case for a lot of newer folks as well that are going to experience robust hypertrophy. So I think that is a point in the column for research and for projects like this, is because we're not going to know on the individual level whether protocol A or protocol B is better for you. You can tell whether protocol A or protocol B was sustainable or it didn't hurt you, but you probably can't tell whether you got 1 versus 1.2x units of hypertrophy. But those things might add up over time, and you might care about that, especially if you're trying to take this as far as you can. So I think you kind of, in a lot of ways, have to just make sure you're moving in the right direction and things are generally satisfactory based on your training advancement, and then optimize within constraints based on what we think we know from projects like this. And to take it all the way back, I imagine I speak for both Zach and Jake when I say this, in the sense that we got into research, or the reason we are interested in research now might be a little bit different than when we initially got into it. But that element of why we initially got into it, in terms of just these fundamental training questions that we didn't have satisfactory answers to, that's kind of why we got into it. And I think that, and I give all the credit to Zach for this, because he's the one that kind of spearheaded this actually continuous approach to these sorts of things, as opposed to a categorical approach to giving us those insights, because you do have to, in a way, put your faith into what we think we know, because practically it's very hard to actually tell that 1 versus 1.2x difference in growth, as Jake said. So I'm really glad Jake brought that up.
Yeah, I could go on a long diatribe about talking about individual observations and trying to tease out what works and how you would even ascertain that information on the individual level. That's why I've been sitting on my dissertation data for up to 2 years now. That topic is so challenging, and I think I figured it out, and it's fooled me again, and it's just so many different times. And so I think I cannot underscore more the idea that the whole reason we do science is that it's very challenging to use our own experience to derive what's actually happening under the hood. That's kind of, if you're kind of drawing up in the sand why science is helpful in the first place, that's why. And so I strongly agree that the one biggest benefit of these projects is because that is somewhat of a logistical reality. It's a little bit better for strength. Like Josh said, we can measure our 1RM more frequently, but most people aren't going and getting weekly DEXA scans or ultrasound assessments to be able to validate their training approaches. And even if you did, it'd take some pretty serious work to be able to even try to say, did this training intervention benefit me truly more than this other training intervention, as opposed to the 90,000 other factors that contribute to that variation over time. I think you kind of just have to obviously take those long scale checkpoints. Like I'm sure for you, Steve, your stage photos and probably photos at a similar body weight are kind of like sacrosanct, and you probably hold those very dearly, because that's probably your only metric in terms of the direct assessment of the thing that we actually care about, which is how tight are my sleeves when I wear my favorite t-shirt from 10th grade, right? Like that's the objective standard that you need to hold yourself to. And that's really, that for hypertrophy directly, that's all you can really do. Now, of course, we have indirect proxies, like how do I look, just generally speaking? Am I visually tracking a trend? Am I looking at my body weight? Am I looking at my performance? Obviously, all those things are helpful, but all those same tools are influenced by a lot of components of variation that we can't disentangle from my own experience on any given day, just like everything else. So I do think it is helpful to realize, I kind of think about, your experience in the gym as like this big, cauldron of ingredients that you're going to take a scoop out of, and that's what your performance is, or that's what your muscle size is on a given day. And there's all these different things that get added in there. And ultimately, the one thing that we've tried to establish with these projects is that there's this, hopefully decent sized chunk of information that gets poured in there that we can be relatively confident in is kind of this general overall relationship. And then these other things kind of get thrown in and manifested on top of it to actually, lead to that scoop and ultimately how it tastes for you or whatever the analogy is. I'm still workshopping that. It's kind of rough, but yeah, it's an unfortunate reality of observing things in real time versus kind of what we know in the clouds are kind of these population level effects that, for the most part kind of exist for all people, but the degree to which you actually observe those in any given scenario is dependent on all these other factors. Yeah.
Very well said, guys. And I know I was making a joke out of what you said there, Jake. But it's again, coaches like to try and sell like this magic kind of secret that they've got. In reality, a lot of, at least what I do with clients, is trying to get like, I'm looking at, okay, how can we maximize sleep, because that's going to maximize recovery, that's going to maximize their ability to do volume, that's going to maximize results. How do we kind of get their nutrition set up so that like a surplus is probably going to lead to the best recoverability, again, best training, performance is driving muscle growth. Like, how do I get their stimulus within the gym as high as possible, but also recoverable, and do that for as long as possible? And that's what I really focus on, is that process element. And then, yeah, we check photos now and then, and like, yeah, we're making sure performance overall is going up. But I'll get people like asking, oh, that iliac lat pull down, have you seen like noticeable growth in your like lower lats? And I'm like, like, I've been training for almost 20 years. It's not like I never trained that division of my lat before. The only area I can say in recent time that I've like seen very notable change in is my calves. And the length and partials were an actual game changer for those. And I'd lacked even like a my muscle connection with my right calf, and it's smaller than my left. And so but like anyone who's been training close to 10 years, it's going to be really challenging to like know is like, am I doing the absolute optimal thing? What I wanted to, the point I was going to come to here was something that your research did really nicely for me, Zach, initially yours, was there was discussion surrounding, is like 3 RAR equivalent to training to failure? And so it's like, well, failure is clearly more fatiguing. You don't have to be a kind of a sports scientist to even know that. You just had to do it in the gym. You can experience it. So I was almost like, erring to like being worried about training too hard. Whereas actually your research then really allowed me to be like, no, lean into the hard training. Then through experience, as Jake kind of said, hey, the fatigue monster isn't there. You can adapt to this really hard training, and you don't have to immediately deload as soon as you kind of hit a 0 RAR within a training session. And then the volume research was great, because I did think there was this inverted U, and I had this kind of idea that potentially you are just able to recover from more. You're not actually getting more growth, you're just able to recover from it. But it kind of allowed me to be like, hey, actually, if I can do more and I'm feeling good for it, I'm probably going to get a benefit from it. Again, if I'm recovering on time and performance seems to be going in the right direction. So I think I at some point said that the research hasn't really like changed how I do things, but it definitely has. It's given me more confidence to lean into certain aspects, because I think, like some of the things I mentioned were questions and doubts that some people had. Whereas like leaning into just, okay, also when I pull it back to what bodybuilders did to grow, it's like, yeah, they really just made sure they were pushing themselves really hard with a variety of aspects. And when they felt good to go again, if they were trying to maximize things, they're probably going again and pushing hard again.
Yeah,
I think
Steve,
if you think about go ahead. Just go, Josh.
Yeah, I'll make it quick. Two quick things. The first is, I think a lot of people have conflated strength research with hypertrophy research, and I know for sure I am guilty of that, because you kind of assume they do at least point you in the same direction in terms of like, if you have a strength outcome, that might also apply for hypertrophy, or at least there's some degree of overlap. And I still think there is some degree of overlap, potentially a good amount of overlap. But, I would say if I'm coaching a powerlifter versus someone interested in physique improvements, fatigue management is going to be a fundamental aspect of the strength athlete program design. And therefore, we're probably going to train with lower velocity loss or more reps in the tank. We're going to try to set things up so that they have 1 or 2 days per week where they feel really good and they can kind of express that top end strength a little bit better. Whereas on the hypertrophy side of things, there are of course elements to fatigue management, but I don't think it's like as quite as detrimental or something that you are truly optimizing for. Like you said, Steve, I think you're optimizing for the stimulus. And the second thing I was going to say is just to underscore what you said about some of the doubts we had about pushing hard and the fatigue monster. I remember when I met Zach, this was probably a couple years and right around when we started Data Driven Strength in like 2019 or so, we were like speculating about, potentially those reps as you got all the way to failure, like the final rep or two being like counterproductive. And I'm not saying we necessarily held that belief, but you could reason through, or you could hypothesize, and you could use scientific terminology and concepts you can find in textbooks to come up with theories or come up with hypotheses that would definitely say that you should train with 4 to 5 RER for all of your hypertrophy training. That's why we actually need to do outcome-oriented research. So yeah, hopefully that adds a little bit of color to what Steve said. But what were you going to say, Zach?
First and foremost, it's hilarious you brought the Mile Journal article up. I literally made a note yesterday to go back and do just a reflection on that, and just how many things we just got just absolutely dead face wrong. Like it's funny looking back at that and some of the the predictions you would have made based on that kind of article, and kind of what the proximity to failure story kind of ended up being when we did things more formally. So I just think that's a hilarious reflection in hindsight. But the thing I was going to say is, like, Steve, when you were talking about just like the anecdotes of bodybuilders and stuff too, like one thing I always do is just like try to like super zoom out and just kind of like validate our principles against like, what didn't hold people back. At least I guess you could say they succeeded despite or in spite of. It's kind of hard to know, but I think the variation in the training practices of elite bodybuilders can be perfectly explained by kind of what we're talking about here. Is like both of these levers contribute to the umbrella of stimulus, and if you're pulling really hard on one of them, you're probably going to have to pull back on the other one to make it fit within that calendar year. And I think that's really how I view like the kind of the manifestation of these papers. Is like, at the end of the day, we probably don't have to be worried that we're going to suddenly be getting less stimulus without knowing it. And so that's like principle A. And then principle B is like, there's many routes to stimulus that you can ultimately optimize over the course of a calendar year. And you're just trying to find the combination of variables that for you and your life context and your exercise selection, your preferred training style, the gym atmosphere that you train in, all those things, you're just trying to find the kind of the problem optimization that gets you to that, optimized stimulus. But there's almost certainly multiple routes to get there, and you can probably change those things over time as things get stale and all these kind of things. Like, that's where all of these applied anecdotes of these really high level athletes can all kind of fit in the same pot. And those are the principles that I like to hang my hat on, rather than the different ones where it only applies to like a select example of people that were really successful. So that's another thing that gives me comfort for these papers, is like, if you really zoom out, I think the improved clarity and understanding and like giving a visual to these dose response relationships, honestly, I personally think it's extremely helpful from a coaching troubleshooting perspective, because it allows you to really weigh those decisions. As Jake said, you may not be able to detect it, but from like a problem solving perspective, I think it's extremely helpful. And I think it has changed the way that I coach for sure. But at the same time, when you zoom out and kind of just validate those from the anecdotes of really successful people, I think they make a lot of sense, and don't fundamentally rock the boat with a lot of those things, and just kind of give us a nice update to maybe some of the worries that we had in the past, and probably push some of those aside. Obviously brings forward new questions, but I think it's a fruitful endeavor to kind of validate those against the experience of a lot of successful people, just as like kind of a gut check.
Maybe
that kind of real world test.
Yeah.
Sorry, go for it, Jake.
I'm just saying maybe a reasonable way to frame that is like like we were saying, it's hard to detect, did X actually work better than Y for you? But because we now have this research, you at least can have confidence in the decision that you made. Whereas before we had these, it's kind of a shot in the dark, right? Like, you just can't have super high confidence either way. Now we still don't have super high confidence in terms of like materially detecting the difference, but at least we have the data to lean on, right? So.
It makes me think of creatine. Like, I'm sure we all take creatine. It's like, do any of us actually notice when we're taking it or not taking it? But we take
It's the
it
black
because there's
pillar
good
here.
research, right?
I'll be able to tell you this. I literally took creatine today for the first time in like 5 years, probably. So maybe I'll be able to tell you.
What?
Yeah.
You call
You
yourself
didn't
a
take it throughout
bodybuilder.
your prep at all?
Nah.
That's
I'm
wild.
cheap
to
and
me.
lazy, bro.
You're worried about
I-
losing your hair, right?
Actually, you know what? Part of me was. I was like, it took me so long to finally grow this thing. I don't want to lose
Doesn't
it.
matter, brother.
I
The devil gets us all.
I'm here's an idea I'll float to you guys, and I'm curious your perspective. So, Steve was talking about with his clients, his goal is to create the environment and to make sure the stimulus is there, and then kind of confirm things are moving in the right direction. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Steve, but that's kind of what I gathered. And you mentioned sleep. That's kind of a core thing that is there for the environment, right? Making sure sleep is sufficient. Do you guys think that we could get to the point and have enough confidence in these fundamental training variables such that it's similar to sleep in the sense that you kind of know that it's a good thing? Of course, you could spend so much time in bed that you are no longer tired enough to go to bed the next night. So you kind of have this practical inverted U of time in bed. You could sleep too long such that you don't have any time to work. And then, now stress levels are high and that. So there are practical limitations to additional sleep, just like there are practical limitations to additional volume or training closer to failure at times. But I wonder if that is a better way to think about these variables, is that they are just the environment. And it's different in the sense that you're applying a stimulus, whereas sleep, I guess, is more passive in nature. But is anyone picking up what I'm putting down? It's just something I thought of when Steve was talking.
It makes me think of, I guess there's many routes to stimulus. So you might try and maximize it through, I'm going to change everything to leg press for my quad work, or like all compound work, or I'm going to do deadlifts because they've got the biggest raw stimulus magnitude or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But then the fatigue cost comes with it. So then that limits you there. It's like, oh, okay, volume's the route I'm going to go down. Like I said, it's going to be all leg curls. It's like, yeah, but they're not as stimulative if you don't have your RDL in there as well. You're missing that hip hinge. And so you just have to you try and piece it together to optimize the stimulus to fatigue trade-off. But as soon with stimulus comes fatigue, and with less stimulus comes less fatigue, but then you have to do more of it. And there's going to be some obvious no-brainers. Don't do it. Probably rack pulls for most people aren't a good trade-off. But there's loads of good answers, and you can kind of have a bit of a play around with it. But there's limiters there. I really want to maximize quad growth, but I can only recover from so much, and performance will just start going down if not. I don't know if I've captured what you were trying to capture there.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that there is, maybe we should just think of stimulus in general as the environment and less about this elusive thing that we need to fundamentally conceptualize at a really nuanced level. So in a way, I think with our general findings here, we can kind of filter down the core thing here, is that you need to have an environment of a pretty high stimulus to maximize your outcomes. And I think it's almost can become as simple as something like a sleep recommendation, such that, hey, you should get enough sleep such that you're not exhausted when you wake up. You should get enough stimulus such that you're not completely wrecked by the time that you circle around to train that muscle group again, something like that. So it's more just the stimulus is part of the environment as opposed to something that requires this weird constellation of factors in order to optimize. And I think that can simplify things for a lot of folks. I think that can be quite freeing for a lot of folks. I also think it leads to a lot of interesting questions. For example, something that Steve, I'm sure you've probably had a roundtable or two on this over the years, is something like deloads. So not only do we have the stimulus, but does that stimulus kind of have a shelf life? We know that gains kind of taper off over time naturally as someone becomes more advanced, but could you restore some of that sensitivity to training by changing the stimulus or by taking a little bit of time off? So I think one thing that I'm pleased with in terms of these projects is twofold. The first is that a lot of the discussion and debate about this has been more so about what to do with the information as opposed to the information itself. And this is something Zach pointed out to me, is that there's been a lot of back and forth about why does the dose response between volume and hypertrophy and the dose response between volume and strength, why do those differ? How is that possible? I think that's a totally fair question to answer, and it's fruitful, it's healthy to discuss those things. But no one is saying that, hey, in the volume research, additional volume doesn't tend to lead to additional hypertrophy with the measurements we have. So it's, I think, making our discussions as a scientific community more fruitful and more directed, which I think is great. And I also think it can lead to some of those other questions about, like, okay, that really high level concept we think we've landed on, higher stimulus probably good. What if we change that stimulus? Because deloads are something that a lot of coaches have used for one reason or another. So can we better identify why you might want to use a deload, so that can better inform the high level principle? So that's what excites me, is about what is just making, I guess, just to put simply, to push the field forward a little bit, and hopefully we've nudged it even just a little bit.
I got another practical thing.
What's that, Jake?
But I actually understood what you meant by the sleep thing that time. I was a little lost that first time, I won't lie.
Yeah, it's like that. It's like the last time I was on Revive Stronger, we were talking about something related to maximizing progressive overload, and it made so much sense in my head. And then I listened back to it, I was like, I did not explain that well, so I made a point to re-explain myself.
If I could simplify what you said, make sure I'm understanding as well. The sleep is like a pretty high fidelity thing, but it's a pretty simple recommendation. And we could kind of get to the same place with stimulus. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Bingo.
Okay, cool. I just had another practical thing that I thought of, that, like, I think the kind of the practical framework that we've kind of come to throughout this discussion has been like, all right, sit down, kind of think about this on an appropriate time scale, somewhere around a year. And I have these different levers that I can pull from a stimulus perspective to try to kind of maximize the stimulus under the curve, right? And there's probably some like sufficient bottom end that you kind of want to be on both variables, mostly thinking about, if Steve goes from doing the volumes that you're performing currently, you drop that down to 2 sets a week per muscle group. Although we found like the quote unquote minimum effective dose was somewhere around 4, that's probably not going to maintain most of your tissue. So like there's probably some like bottom end thresholds you want to be aware of, but for the most part, pick and choose the levers based on preferences, based on what you think is going to optimize the stimulus under the curve in your situation. That's kind of the general framework that we're operating within. And that's essentially coming back to Steve's nice statement that I can't remember that was really, really good. I promise, although I can't remember it. The thing that I think is really important to remember, though, from a practical perspective, when you start pulling different levers, is that is under the assumption that everything else is held constant, which I think it's not as trivial as it sounds. Like, I think when you're actually going to the gym, right, and let's say you've increased your volume 20%, and you've maintained your RIR prescriptions for all your exercises, it may seem like that's a pretty easy thing to continue to execute, but I don't think it is. And I think that's a really big thing that has led to a lot of the discordant anecdotes, particularly when it comes to like higher volume training didn't work for me. And specifically, if you look at the research, although we're not entirely confident on some of the failure definitions that are in it, it is high volume training of studies that report training to failure. So it's one of these things where almost a prerequisite of this conversation is that you're maintaining the quality in all other aspects. That comes from motivation and intent and psychological, awareness of your actual each set. That comes from the execution of each exercise. That comes from the exercises that you're selecting. All of these things kind of have to be maintained at a consistent level for that change to actually make sense and actually increase the net stimulus. And again, I think from a practical perspective, that's a lot harder than it seems, even for people who have been training for a very long time. Like if I ask you, Steve, I guarantee if you like doubled let's say you're doing 2 sets of leg press, and you double that to 4, and you maintain your RIRs on the prescription there. Although you may think that it is the case, that can be something that can kind of creep over time and start to become an issue. And I think I've heard you kind of talk about this before, is like kind of chasing the volume dragon. And I think that is something that can happen to a lot of people, even that are really advanced. So it's one of those things where when you do pull one of the levers, you have to almost like dial into the opposite lever even more to make sure that it maintains at the level that you're trying to fix that at. And so I think that's another just a really important thing to kind of put into the calculus when you are designing these kind of, plans over the course of the year of like, okay, what do I think is realistic to optimize the stimulus? You got to be really honest with yourself, because saying that you can perform, 5 or 6 sets of a multi-joint lower body exercise at 1 RAR when you had been doing 2 or 3, that's probably not a safe assumption for most people if you really get in there and do it week after week after week and not having some of those creep. And I think the same thing can be said for the proximity to failure end of the equation, like making sure that if you are decreasing your volume, making sure that those sets are pushed really, really hard. Sometimes when you don't kind of get into a flow of a session, the sets don't feel the same. I don't really know how to quantify that or anything, but hopefully you guys are going to know what I mean, is like a set of an exercise, like one of the first couple sets taken to a certain RAR, doesn't always feel the same subjective stimulus wise as a set after you've maybe warmed up a little bit more than you probably should, and those kind of things. So I think there's just like additional nuances to consider there, that when you are thinking about that stimulus end of the curve, that can seem extremely simple on paper, but when you actually put your shoes on and get to work, it's a little bit more complicated than it may seem.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. I've often thought about these things as like thresholds. Like we need to meet at least a minimum volume threshold to be certain we're growing well, a minimum rep and reserve to be sure we're growing really well. And although we can be more confident in the volume research, I do think that even that thought and concept could take you into like this volume trap, which I've named it, where it's like you lean so far into volume that now you are training, you're not meeting that threshold for growth, or you're much further from failure than you thought. Especially if you started there and then you've just added sets, and suddenly you're like, oh, I must have been at like 8 RAR and then I've finished at 4, whereas actually I intended to be at 4 and then 1 or what have you, and that can be a problem. So I do like people to like almost, I kind of in my head at least as I'm talking just off the cuff here, I'm thinking like we need to meet that threshold for intensity, and then the volume is more of a lever, like a dial that we can try and dial up over time, but without ever falling back from that 3 RAR. And like at least practically for me, I almost, once I've met that threshold, I then don't think about it anymore. I'm just like, I have to at least match or beat that, and then I'm just accumulating what I can within my recovery limits. And yeah, if I was doing it with a client, some who aren't chasing kind of maximal growth, I'm just like, hey, if you're seeing progression, you feel good, let's just run that for as long as we can. Others who are trying to maximize, I'm like, hey, if you're feeling good and we could add a bit here if you're after that and you're willing to invest that time, and it's diminishing returns, of course, if they're just like, yeah, let's do it, then we'll kind of play around with that. So that's at least, as a coming to some practical recommendations, that's at least a little bit of my kind of practical recommendation there. I don't know if any of you guys have like some harder practical recommendations. I think actually, Josh, I heard you on a reel recently. You said that you don't even, I think it was something along the lines, I'll try and quote you, as something along the lines, if you're not even sure, we should have said the 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week as a recommendation. You kind of feel like that maybe got put out there as too much of like a hard rule for people to think about.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of 2 minds when it comes to specific numbers and specific recommendations. Hopefully the listener is taking away that we value kind of the qualitative understanding of the nature of the dose response relationship between the variable and the outcome of interest. But at the same time, that's cannot be the most practical thing in the world. And I think what I was saying in that reel and kind of my opinion is, I think the double-edged sword of recommendations is you feel like if you're not within that range, so if you are below the range of 10 to 20 sets per muscle per week, or you're above it, you're doing something wrong. Whereas I think we could all think of plenty of people that do less than 10 sets per muscle per week, or maybe some muscles do less than 10 sets. And there are plenty of people, like Eric Helms comes to mind. I know he's doing quite a bit more than 20 sets per muscle per week, at least for some muscles, I believe.
Bad scientist.
Yeah, exactly. So and that would be a bit of a straw man to say that people that made that recommendation would also say that you can't go above or below it. So it's again, I'm of two minds of it. I think 10 to 20 sets is a solid recommendation. I think it was reasonable at the time. I still think it's pretty good. I'm very hesitant to do these sorts of things. I'd probably just widen it a little bit, especially on the lower end. I think, maybe starting around 6 or 8 is a little bit more palatable for a lot of people, and I think can be very, very potent with good exercise execution, good proximity to failure, and a progressive mindset. But again, I'm quite hesitant to give specific numbers and instead would rather, talk through it long form like this. Something that I have found quite practical, but also isn't numerical, is asking a client about kind of that excitement, or sometimes it can even spill into like nervousness before a session, which I think is a good thing, right? I think before a session, especially like a hard session, you kind of feel your body getting ready to perform, right? A power lifter is going to know this really well, kind of those butterflies before they start warming up on the platform or for a big session. If you're training for hypertrophy, I think you also feel that as well, especially for some sessions. And what I specifically like to ask is, why are you feeling that feeling? In your mind, is it because you're excited to perform and to have a progressive mindset and to really execute the training really well? Or are you feeling that kind of nervousness / excitement because you're like, oh my gosh, I have so much work to get in and I'm dreading it? If you start to, think about your session about, oh my gosh, I have so much work to get in, I think that's when you've fallen into the volume trap, as you've named it, Steve, which I think is very much a thing. So I think something like that can be just as helpful as a specific numerical recommendation. And it's something I've, as a result of these cumulative projects, is something that I've used in practice just to ask, and can go a long way to understand where someone's at in terms of their ability to tolerate more or whether we need to scale back.
That is so beautifully said. I've never heard someone talk it through in that way, but that's exactly how, especially for me at the moment, I think about training my legs and training my quads, because I really want those things to grow. And I am often tempted to add, but every time in the session, I'm like, I'm screwed. I don't want to add any more here, because I'm teetering on that edge of, I'm excited to train and I'm close to what you mentioned there, where I'm almost daunted and it's feeling like too much of a task, but I'm careful not to push over that, because I have before, just because I'm like, more is better. And that's something I actually ask within my training programs, is like, do you feel like you can handle more for this muscle group within this session? And get this kind of, I'm using a perceived recovery score at the moment, like out of 10, how are you feeling at the end of the week? Out of 10, be up, or out 0, you feel fresh. I think it's actually the other way around, but it kind of gives you an idea. So I think that's a really nice. And the 10 to 20, I agree with you in terms of, I think people have taken it too far, as if it's like, I've had posts where I've said a recommendation, I've put 6, and they're like, what's that based off? I'm like, I know the general spoken is 10 to 20, but I mean, there's lots of limitations there, and through my personal experience, I think 6 is very appropriate for some people. So I think that was beautifully said. I don't know if Zach, if you've got any practical recommendations for your proximity to failure stuff.
Yeah, I think just to kind of echo what you said there, and then mirror it to the proximity to failure stuff, is that's pretty much how I view the recommendations too. Is you can get numbers out of these meta-analyses, but those are contingent upon the specifications of the training interventions that are in the studies, right? So if your leg press execution is 10 times better, if your, RER accuracy, let's say that it wasn't perfectly accurate in the studies, if all those factors aren't exactly the same, the nature of the dose response relationship could theoretically be the exact same shape, but the actual manifestation of the exact numbers may be substantially different. It's kind of the way that I tend to think about it. And so I am usually also quite resistant on giving numbers. I would also, similar to Josh, would increase the range of pretty much all the variables, because I think that's where you kind of get the concept of what we're ultimately talking about. And again, I think thinking about it from that conceptual basis on what direction are these headed and at what rate and what shape, that's really the question to answer yourself or ask yourself. And so I think for the proximity to failure stuff, I think it's relatively similar. I think from my personal experience, and again, you could craft up a mathematical example why this isn't necessarily the best approach to take. I think that on average, I've been shifted kind of closer to failure. And this is kind of what I've said since this project is like, I've been shifted closer to failure for my average RAR recommendation. And so I don't think you need to be taking every set to failure, but I also don't think that's something we need to fear anymore. And I think the positive aspects of having regular sets to failure allows you to more accurately anchor your overall RAR accuracy. And if we take one thing away from the RAR meta-analysis, it's that proximity to failure seems to be pretty important for hypertrophy. It's not make or break whether you go to failure or not, but it's a factor we definitely want to consider and be aware of. So I'm more concerned with making sure your RARs are accurate rather than the RARs themselves. And I think that's really where the benefits of training to failure regularly come in. And so that's part of it. And the other aspect of this is I've added this kind of this if-then kind of aspect of the decision making that I think I try to think about this with most things in programming, but with proximity to failure, it's a really big one, is that I think we used to think about the fatigue aspect of this kind of just like in a general sense, but I really try to apply this to every exercise and even some muscle groups. And I think this is where some of the crossover comes with some of the muscle length stuff, for example. So like on back work, as an example, for the longest time, I would ask myself these questions of just purely as an experiment after or as we were kind of collecting some of the results of the meta-analysis. And like we kind of talked about earlier, I was definitely not expecting a linear relationship closer to failure. If anything, I probably would have bet against that before we started that project. And I understood kind of the underlying data a little bit better. And so I wanted to just see what is the kind of the manifestation of these results and how it would suggest that I train. So I probably not advisably started taking pretty much every single thing to failure just to see kind of how these things held up in kind of a real world scenario. And I really quickly realized that this kind of if-then principle is really, really important. So on my back work, for example, I could ask myself, if I take this set to failure, is it going to reliably tank the rest of my session in terms of performance or even just the next set? And it didn't. And so for me, at least in those specific exercises that I was doing, it seems essentially like quote unquote free stimulus to take those sets closer to failure. And then, you start adding other aspects of the equation like partials after the set taken to failure. You can play with all those kind of things in this concept, but that's usually what I kind of think about is like, okay, regular exposure of sets taken close to failure is probably a good thing, both for practical reasons, but also the stimulus that it provides. And I can take this on an exercise by exercise basis. I don't necessarily need to think about it in this global scale. And I want to ask myself, if I take these sets or the majority of the sets close to failure or to failure, is that going to have these negative ramifications that are going to impact the stimulus under the curve that I achieve throughout the year? And so that's kind of the two-step decision-making process that I ask myself when I actually go to program. And so to give a concrete recommendation, although this makes my skin crawl, I usually am starting out for multi-joint exercises are probably somewhere in like the 3 RAR range on kind of the first set. And then that's probably going to fall as you get closer to the last set of that exercise. And you're going to take the last set as close as safe to whatever failure point that is. If it's a bench press, I'm probably not going to have you fail a rep, so 0 to 1 RAR. If it's a machine chest press, I'm probably going to have you fail there on your last set, or maybe even do some partials on that if it's a safe exercise to do so. And then for single joint exercises or exercises that essentially have no safety concerns, and you can also play into this with resistance profiles and muscle lengths and things like that, I'm probably just going to shift those recommendations a little bit closer to failure, start a little bit closer, 1 to 2 RAR, last set taken to failure, maybe partials, etc., those kind of things, and just kind of scale it in that way. Because the reason being that seems to provide a good balance of maximizing the quote theoretical stimulus in that given session while providing me the ability to come back to that session week after week with that progressive mindset that Josh said, and also approach that week after week and month after month for that entire calendar year to kind of maximize that theoretical stimulus. Whereas taking the literal recommendation from the meta-analysis of taking every single set to failure, I think that's not going to do so.
Yeah, very well said. I think that also aligns nicely with what the meta-analysis found, where those big compound heavier lifts don't have as strong a relationship, but do have that relationship. So yeah, erring a bit closer to failure for the isolation lifts like calves and stuff like that. And so it makes a ton of sense there, Zach. Thank you very much. I don't know if we kind of got the volume and intensity recommendations. I don't know if there's anything, Jake, you have on mind to add towards for the mix of the practical recommendations? I know yours was just single session.
Yeah, I think where the single session stuff comes in really handy is when we start to think about frequency, especially for hypertrophy. Because as Josh mentioned, the weekly frequency stuff, like there's just not a clear, strong impact of frequency yet. We see this dose response, but then on the per session level, it tapers off much sooner than the weekly level. Like, there's something going on here, right? So what I've been saying is like, it's annoying because as we all have discussed, it's hard to put, we're hesitant to put hard numbers on it, but based on the data, once we start getting into those, 10, 11, 12 sets in one workout, probably go ahead and split into a higher frequency from that point. Like on the high end, right? You certainly could split to a higher frequency earlier than that, and there's a valid argument that that would even be superior. The data doesn't necessarily bear that out, at least yet, until we get more studies. But I think there's a valid argument just based on the diminishing returns, right? But then the question is like, when we say once you get to really high per session volumes, go ahead and split into another session. Well, like, what's high? How do I know it's too high? And so, in the absence of helpful data yet, and hopefully my dissertation sheds a little bit of light on this, but just thinking through some of the like logical things that we've seen in coaching and whatever, and credit where it's due. Mike Igital and yourself have talked about a lot of these things for a long time, and they seem to hold pretty true in my experience as well. And that's like, if you come into a session and you're still sore and you still are just like dreading to have to train this muscle group again and stuff like that, it's like, well, maybe that last time you trained this muscle is a little too much. Maybe we do a little bit less in that session. Or like if you're training today and, your performance is stable within normal fluctuations, right? Like you're going to lose a rep or two set to set or whatever. Maybe you have to adjust the weight by 5 or 10 pounds to kind of stay within your general rep range, whatever you got to do. But once you hit set, 8 for that muscle group, now all of a sudden you have to cut the weight in half to keep that rep range. I don't know, man. Maybe just go ahead and split it before you hit that point, right? Like I can't say that super confidently, but just based on my experience, it seems to make enough of a reasonable amount of sense to kind of give at least something to pay attention to while you're training. Or another thing I've noticed, it's hit and miss with people. But some people will experience this where you're training and you get a pump and you get a bigger pump as you keep going. But then if you keep going, it goes away and you just kind of feel numb and like, it's weird. It's like your pump goes away, but we're still training. Is that still productive training? Maybe, but I don't know for sure. And that seems like another thing that just is like, man, it feels like we're doing too much. I don't know. Right. So again, very low confidence, massive grain of salt. Right. But those are just a couple other little indicators that I tend to think about that seem to be helpful. Right. So some of it's physical stuff, just subjective perceptions. Some of it is performance stuff. Again, there's going to be a drop off. It's just, is that drop off weirdly massive? Something to take note of. And then some of it is like the psychology, like you just can't stand the thought of going into train legs yet. You need another day or whatever. That's some of the stuff I look at. But yeah, I think it's the weird thing about the precession stuff is it really does support a wide variety of approaches, like all the data have, like we talked about, right? Like you could go the 4 or 5 times frequency route with really low precession volumes. And that seems awesome. Or you could go, twice a week with higher precession volumes. That also seems awesome. So, and one final thing I'll say just to kind of echo what's also been said is that I think that some of the difficulty with like making these adjustments on the fly, and like what Zach was talking about with like, if you increase your volume by 20%, but you can't maintain the other things, and it's probably not the best decision in that moment. It's even more reason like small adjustments, right? We're just kind of nudging things along, and maybe you look up 6 months later and it's a big change from what you used to do, but we don't want to make a huge change all at once because it just gets super impractical. So I just wanted to slide that in there as well.
So well said, and a really good summary, guys. If I was to try and summarize, to put some numbers to it, just for the listeners and for myself, I guess, but like weekly volumes, we're looking at like a minimum threshold. Like try and think about 6, maybe up to 8 as like a lower end, and you can then dial that up potentially. We want to be around 3 RER or less for like the proximity to failure, and then per session, I mean, basically it was a case of, hey, divide up your weekly volume once you're kind of getting to a point of which you're feeling like it's not being productive anymore, kind of auto-regulating that. And if you pull on one lever for a little bit, you might have to pull back on another one, just to kind of bear that in mind. And also just reflecting on the fact that it could differ muscle group to muscle group, person to person. Like, these are just relationships that you're looking at. I think about what you said there, Zach, with your back, where you're like, hey, I can just like train that to failure and it doesn't seem to cause me any more fatigue. I think about that the same with number of sets it can handle within a single session. It can handle definitely more than something like my quads or my hamstrings, and therefore my frequencies might even be lower. I don't know, the weekly volume's just higher, but I just think it's a case of you guys and the research you've done has given us great kind of rough parameters to kind of base our practical recommendations from, and then it's real world experience which is going to allow us to navigate it better. And the longer you do this, the better you get auto-regulating, and small adjustments, as you said there, Jake, is definitely the way to go. So yeah, guys, thank you so much for this chat. It's been fantastic. I can't believe it's been 2 hours. We could probably go for 4 quite comfortably. Good that no one needed a loo break. I'm particularly surprised I didn't. I'll make sure that rather than to go around each of you individually to tell people where they can find you, I'll just make sure I've got all your details, your Instagram handles, your YouTube. I know you guys, Josh and Zach, you've been doing a lot of podcasts yourself, like long format, great discussions, super valuable. Jake, obviously you have your podcast as well. So I'll make sure they're linked in there too, because if people are listening to this and they've got this far, they probably want more from you guys. And yeah, thank you once again for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you in the next episode.